So the importance of word is what he starts talking about on page 454. One quote is this: "Word has the power to change our understanding of ourselves. This power does not originally take the form of an imperative. It's altered by a listening that understands." Right? So when a word is spoken, it has the power to change us in a way that doesn't have anything to do with rules or duty or ethics. You know, so if I say, "Jim, you look beautiful. You look beautiful tonight." And if that word speaks to you, if you're hearkening to it, that sense that I am beautiful, just that word shapes things. I mean, do you feel that just a little bit? Sure. It shapes things. And it's not that you obey the word beautiful the way that you'd obey, like if I demanded that you make me a peanut butter and jelly sandwich or something, right? I mean, it's a different kind of obedience. If you hearken to that phrase, "You're beautiful," "You're good," something like that, right? That's the kind of obedience that he's talking about. That's the power of that language has to change us if we're open to being changed. And that's the foundation of the pre-ethical way around accusation that he's looking for. Right? It's that hearkening to word or language, or the power of language to just totally alter how we see things. I mean, how many of you have had one of those like random words tossed out at you throughout a day that's radically changed the course of that day? It's no one word or no other word, but something really resonates with a word spoken. It's just kind of uttered in a thoughtful rather than a thoughtless manner that really affects you. And that's what word can do. And when we obey the invitation of language to reorient ourselves, that's the kind of obedience that he's talking about, right? And that's what gives us freedom. It's the freedom to opt toward the paths that those kinds of words open. But there's no, I mean, you don't rebel against it. I mean, if I said, "Jake, you're beautiful," then you're like, I'm ugly. Like, I mean, that wouldn't make sense to rebel against that, right? I mean, it's not that kind of prohibition. There's no accusation. There's no demand. It's just language opening up and allowing a kind of freedom, introducing to you something that hadn't been in your world before. And then you're like, wow. And if you really let that settle through, it can really change your whole life, powerfully and profoundly. Words have power. They're important. And that's what Ricœur's returning back to. Number 2. Our modifications through word precedes the principle of obligation in acting upon us. Here's another quote. "This intimate connection between our desire to be and the power of word is a consequence of what we have referred to above as the act of hearkening, of paying attention, of obeying." Right? So we have the desire to be, we have the power of word, and what Ricœur's just saying is that we can harness these together, right? To understand the power of language and to hearken, to listen to words, to listen to what language can do. And it's not even a spoken word necessarily. I mean, how many of you have read something that's reoriented how you think through things? Changed your worldview, giving you an insight that you hadn't had into your own situation existentially, right? It just jars you, it frees you, it opens up new things, it shakes away some of the things that have calcified, and it liberates you to be something more. And what Ricœur's asking is a pre-ethical stance is just to be open to that, to hearken for those words or toward those words that would have that kind of liberating potential, to be thirsty for them, to be aware that they exist. So that's that. 3 implications for today's lecture. Number 1, I think what Ricœur does in this section is to think through the implications of critique, even those critiques that have conviction behind them, the way that Freud's and Nietzsche's do, in order to see their limitations. Right? I mean, a critique is really, really damaging. Like, anybody can go on the negative and point out all the flaws of something. It's a really powerful kind of position. But what Ricœur is willing to do is to see the limitations of that kind of critique in order to show that there's nothing positive that it offers as an alternative. And what he's interested in in the world of confusion left after critique is what positive things can you name? And it's the task of a philosopher to name those positives and to point them out and to spell out a path through the confusion that people can follow. To remain convinced of critique. And so last time, again, we talked about conviction and critique as two possible models, right? I mean, people like to have conviction that what they know is true, or people like to critique those things and say, you don't have the truth, da-da-da-da-da. A lot of times we want certainty, so we'll tend to sway in one direction or the other, right? You'll have the rebels who think everything is false, and you'll have the believers that think that everything is true. But for Ricœur, it's always a dialectic that moves gracefully from a critique to a conviction of something that's truer, but that itself is susceptible to a bigger critique, right? Which leads to a more clear point of conviction. And you're always making progress, but you're not sticking only to one, right? And so in order to move from critique to conviction, you have to have something positive to think through and offer, right? To take something determinately true out from a negation and to open yourself up to that as a possibility. So that's number one. Number two, I think this part of the essay allows us to understand how to think through problems to a more fundamental and more basic framework, which can illuminate new possibilities that later structures overlook. Right? So his method of moving past accusation is not to just say, no, Freud and Nietzsche just never had a true moment with God. Right? I mean, that's not going to answer their critiques. Instead, what he does is it grants their critiques, but look for something more fundamental. Right? And in this case, more fundamental than our relationship to law and commandment and imperative is our relationship to language in general and our ability to listen. And even at that very gentle, basic level, there's something beautiful that can emerge, which is a powerful alternative to that world of accusation. Right? So questioning through to that point is sometimes really, really helpful, especially if you can do it well, which I think Ricœur does. And then number three, there's a beauty to a stance of openness and listening and hearkening. A hearkening soul never feels accusation as a belated sting. Being open to becoming moved is a mode of non-control that remains distinct from being powerless or controlled, right? If I'm just vulnerable to words, if I'm vulnerable to language, if I allow myself to be moved by music or dance or the stars in the sky, right, or whatever, right? If I'm open to being moved, I'm not in control of myself anymore, right? I have to let down my guard. I'm not going to control anybody else when I'm in that mode, but it doesn't mean that I'm in that mode of like obeying somebody else or rebelling against them, right? It's a more fragile, but I think far more beautiful way of existing that I think is underappreciated in today's society. Any questions?